There are moments in television history that don't just close a chapter, they define one. A single scene, a few carefully chosen words, a father looking directly into a camera and speaking to an entire nation. That moment came on May 8, 1984, when Happy Days aired its series finale, and for a brief, shining instant, everything was perfect. The Cunningham family had said goodbye. America had said goodbye back. And one of the longest-running sitcoms in television history appeared to have landed exactly where it deserved, with dignity, warmth, and a sense of closure that few shows ever managed to achieve. But perfection on television rarely survives the decisions made in network boardrooms. What followed that farewell in the weeks and months after that finale is one of the strangest, most self-destructive chapters in American broadcasting history. A show that had survived cast shakeups, evolving audience tastes, cultural shifts, and more than a decade of weekly production didn't fall apart because of any failure of storytelling. It was dismantled by the very network that built it through a series of decisions so careless and so tone-deaf that television executives are still using Happy Days as a cautionary tale more than 40 years later. This is the story of the scene that took Happy Days off the air for good, and everything that happened before, during, and after that unforgettable moment. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what Happy Days actually was and why it mattered so much to so many people for so long. The show premiered on ABC in January 1974, created by Gary Marshall, and was built around a deceptively simple premise: a wholesome American family living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin during the 1950s. The Cunninghams were not complicated people. Howard, the father, ran a hardware store and dispensed wisdom with patience and quiet dignity. Marion, his wife, kept the household running with warmth and good humor. Their son Richie was the beating heart of the series, a well-meaning teenager trying to navigate girls, friendship, school, and the particular anxieties of growing up in post-war America. Ron Howard, who had already made his name as a child actor, brought Richie Cunningham to life with a naturalness and likability that television audiences responded to immediately. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't especially cool. He was just a good kid, and in the cynical post-Vietnam, post-Watergate America of the mid-1970s, audiences were hungry for exactly that kind of uncomplicated goodness. But Happy Days had a secret weapon that nobody, including the writers, had fully anticipated. Henry Winkler was cast in the supporting role of Arthur Fonzarelli, a leather jacket-wearing, motorcycle-riding young man from the wrong side of town who hung around the Cunningham family with a casual authority that somehow made everyone around him more interesting. The character was originally intended to appear in just a handful of scenes per episode, a comic foil, a bit of edge to contrast against Richie's clean-cut sweetness. Nobody expected what happened next. By the show's third season, Arthur Fonzarelli had become the biggest television character in America. Kids across the country were mimicking his signature, i.e., barbers were being asked to recreate his slicked-back hair, and toy manufacturers could not keep Fonzie merchandise on shelves. Henry Winkler, who had arrived in Hollywood from New York's theater circuit with barely enough money to survive, suddenly found himself on the cover of national magazines and receiving more fan mail than the entire rest of the cast combined. The Fonz had become a phenomenon, and Happy Days had become something that transcended the category of mere television entertainment. It became a weekly ritual for millions of American families. Success on this scale almost always generates complications, and Happy Days was no exception. As Fonzie's popularity surged, ABC executives began to look at the show's branding and ask themselves a natural but ultimately dangerous question: why not lean harder into the thing that was working best? The answer they arrived at was a proposal to rename the series. Instead of Happy Days, the show would be called Fonzie's Happy Days. From a marketing standpoint, the logic was not entirely unreasonable. The character driving the cultural conversation was Fonzie, so why not make that explicit in the title itself? What ABC's executives failed to appreciate was the creative and psychological damage that such a change would cause. Ron Howard, who was 21 years old at the time, had spent years building Richie Cunningham into a character that audiences genuinely loved. Richie wasn't the flashiest character on the show, but he was its moral center, its emotional anchor, and its narrative engine. To suddenly subordinate him in the very title of the series felt, to Howard, like a declaration that his contributions no longer mattered. He made his position clear in no uncertain terms. If the title changed, he was leaving. For a young actor to draw that kind of line with a major network was an extraordinary act. Industry observers at the time were stunned by Howard's willingness to walk away from one of the most successful shows on American television over what many executives considered a purely cosmetic issue. But Howard understood something those executives did not. The title wasn't cosmetic. It was a statement about what the show fundamentally was. And what Happy Days fundamentally was an ensemble. The reason Fonzie worked as a character was precisely because of the world around him, Richie's decency, Marion's warmth, Howard Cunningham's steady paternal presence. Strip away the ensemble, and what you had wasn't Fonzie at his best. You had a character unmoored from the very relationships that made him compelling. Henry Winkler himself reinforced this point with remarkable clarity and generosity. Rather than using the moment to advocate for his own increased prominence, Winkler sided with Howard. He told network executives directly that his success on the show depended on the ensemble around him, and that there was nothing to be gained by restructuring what was already working. That kind of creative solidarity from a show's biggest star was enough to force ABC to reconsider and ultimately to back down. Gary Marshall, the show's creator, supported his actors, and the title remained Happy Days. But the confrontation left its mark. Ron Howard had already begun to think seriously about stepping back from acting to pursue directing, a transition he would eventually complete with career results that speak for themselves. And the episode revealed something troubling about how ABC's executive team related to the show they were responsible for. They thought about it primarily as a product to be optimized rather than as a piece of storytelling with its own internal logic and integrity. That mindset would resurface, with far more damaging consequences, a few years later. For the better part of a decade after that title dispute, Happy Days continued to do what it did best. It entertained, it reassured, it gave audiences a weekly escape into a version of American life that felt safe and familiar. Characters came and went. The show evolved, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes brilliantly, as it tried to stay relevant across multiple cultural eras. Richie Cunningham eventually left for college, and then the Army. Joni, his younger sister, grew from a peripheral presence into a fully realized character in her own right. New faces joined the ensemble to fill the gaps left by departing cast members. For the better part of a decade after that title dispute, Happy Days continued to do what it did best. It entertained, it reassured, it gave audiences a weekly escape into a version of American life that felt safe and familiar. Characters came and went. The show evolved, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes brilliantly, as it tried to stay relevant across multiple cultural eras. Richie Cunningham eventually left for college, and then the Army. Joni, his younger sister, grew from a peripheral presence into a fully realized character in her own right. New faces joined the ensemble to fill the gaps left by departing cast members. Through all of it, the Cunningham household remained the emotional center of the show, and Tom Bosley's portrayal of Howard Cunningham remained one of television's most consistently reliable performances. Bosley brought to the role a combination of genuine authority and warmth that made Howard feel like someone's actual father rather than a television construction. He was funny without being a buffoon, wise without being preachy, and kind without being saccharine. In a show full of memorable characters, Howard Cunningham was the one who gave everything else its weight. By 1984, after 11 seasons, it was time to say goodbye. The show's final season was built around the idea of giving its characters meaningful closure. Joni and Chachi, who had been a romantic pair for years, would get engaged. Fonzie, the eternal bachelor and wanderer, would adopt a young boy and finally find the family he had always secretly wanted. And the Cunningham household would mark the passage into a new chapter with the grace and dignity that the family had always embodied. It was, on paper and in execution, everything a long-running show's finale should be. And then ABC made a decision that complicated everything. Long before the finale even aired in February 1984, ABC held the broadcast rights to the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia. The games ran from February 8th through February 19th, and during that period, the network cleared its primetime schedule to make room for nightly Olympic coverage. This was standard practice for major sporting events, and in most circumstances, it would have been a manageable disruption for whatever programs happened to occupy those time slots. For Happy Days, which was in the final stretch of its final season, it was a catastrophe in the making. The episodes that had been scheduled to air during the Olympics period were not random filler. They were part of the show's carefully constructed farewell narrative, episodes that were meant to carry audiences from mid-season toward the emotional conclusion that Gary Marshall and his writing team had spent months crafting. Displacing them created an immediate problem. What you do with those episodes once the Olympics are over? ABC's executives faced a choice that should have had an obvious answer. You could delay the finale until later in the season, airing the displaced episodes first and preserving the sequence in which they were meant to be seen. Or you could air the finale on its original schedule in May and figure out the leftover episodes afterward. Any television producer or writer would have told you without hesitation that the first option was the only responsible one. Finales are not interchangeable with regular episodes. They are designed to function as narrative conclusions, as emotional punctuation marks, as the last thing an audience experiences before they carry a show with them into memory. To air the finale before the episodes that were supposed to precede, it was to perform surgery on the show's storytelling structure with a sledgehammer. ABC chose the second option. On May 8, 1984, Happy Days aired Passages, its series finale. And by almost any measure, it was a triumph. The centerpiece of that finale, the moment that crystallized everything Happy Days had been for 11 years, almost didn't make it to air at all. Gary Marshall had a vision for how the show should end, and it was a vision that made ABC's programming executives deeply uncomfortable. Marshall wanted Howard Cunningham to break the fourth wall. He wanted Tom Bosley to turn from whatever was happening in the scene, look directly into the camera, and speak to the audience as if they were people he personally knew. As if they were, in some meaningful sense, members of the extended Cunningham family. In the television of 1984, this was a genuinely radical proposition. The fourth wall, the invisible boundary between the world of a story and the world of its audience, was something that well-behaved television programs simply did not acknowledge, let alone demolish. The conventions of the medium were built around the maintenance of a comfortable fiction, that viewers were peering through a window into another world, that the characters didn't know they were being watched, that the drama or comedy unfolding on screen existed in a self-contained universe sealed off from the living rooms in which it was being consumed. To have a character acknowledge the audience directly was to admit that the whole enterprise was constructed, that the Cunningham family were characters rather than people, that Milwaukee in the 1950s was a set rather than a real place. ABC executives worried that this admission would rupture the emotional connection that the show had spent 11 years building. It would make audiences feel cheated, manipulated, suddenly aware of the machinery behind the magic. Marshall disagreed, and he disagreed with the kind of conviction that comes from understanding something deeply and intuitively that others are only analyzing from the outside. His argument was that Happy Days had already crossed the line between fiction and reality for its audience. People didn't watch the Cunninghams the way they watched a drama or a thriller, with critical distance and analytical attention. They watched them the way you watch people you care about. The show had been in the living rooms of American families for 11 years, longer than most children take to reach adolescence, longer than many marriages last, longer than the span between a young couple's first date and the birth of their first child. The Cunninghams weren't fictional people to millions of viewers. They were presences, familiar and beloved, woven into the texture of family life. If that was true, and Marshall believed it was, then the most honest thing the show could do, in its final moments, was to acknowledge that relationship directly. Not to pretend it didn't exist. Not to perform one more conventional scene, and then fade to black as if nothing unusual was happening. But to look the audience in the eye and say, "We know you've been here. We know what this has meant. Thank you." ABC gave in after prolonged resistance, and the moment aired. Tom Bosley, as Howard Cunningham, turned to the camera in the quiet of the Cunningham living room and spoke. He reflected on what he and Marion had built together, not climbing mountains or writing great novels, but raising 2 children, and watching them grow into the kind of adults who were capable of love and commitment. He acknowledged the audience as participants in that journey, not as passive viewers, but as people who had been genuinely present for something that mattered. And then he offered a toast to the show, to the audience, and to the thing that both had shared across more than a decade. The reaction was not what ABC's executives had feared. There was no sense of rupture or betrayal. Audiences did not feel cheated. They felt seen. Letters poured in describing the moment as one of the most unexpectedly moving things viewers had ever experienced on television. Critics who had dismissed the idea as sentimental gimmickry revised their assessments. Television historians began writing about the Happy Days finale as a landmark, a rare moment when a network sitcom had somehow managed to transcend its own format and connect with audiences on a genuinely human level. The scene that ABC had tried to kill turned out to be the scene that made the finale unforgettable, and then, with perfect and terrible timing, ABC proceeded to undo nearly everything that moment had accomplished. The displaced episodes from a February Olympic scheduling conflict had not disappeared. They were still sitting in a vault somewhere, fully produced, fully edited, waiting for a resolution that ABC's executives had apparently not thought through in any meaningful way. Once the finale had aired and the emotional response had been measured, the network made its decision. The leftover episodes would be broadcast anyway across the summer months of 1984. There was no creative justification for this decision. There was no artistic rationale, no storytelling logic, no consideration of what it would mean for an audience that had already said goodbye to these characters to suddenly find them back on their screens as if the farewell had never happened. There was only the bureaucratic reality that the episodes existed and had been paid for and therefore needed to be used. On June 4, 1984, less than a month after Tom Bosley had given what millions of viewers understood to be his final speech as Howard Cunningham, Happy Days returned to ABC with a new episode. Not a retrospective, not a clip show. A new episode with the characters going about their business as if the finale had never aired. For audiences, the experience was genuinely disorienting. The emotional process of closure is not abstract or trivial. When a story ends, particularly a story that has been part of someone's life for over a decade, the ending triggers a real psychological adjustment. You process the conclusion. You say goodbye. You integrate the story into your memory in its completed form. What you do not expect is for the story to restart 3 weeks later without explanation or acknowledgement that anything unusual is happening. The episodes that aired across the summer of 1984 were not bad television by conventional standards. They were competent, professionally produced half-hours of situation comedy in the style that Happy Days had perfected over 11 years. But competence was entirely beside the point. The problem was not quality. The problem was existence. These episodes should not have existed as broadcast content after May 8, 1984. The only honest thing to do with them was to archive them, not to broadcast them to an audience that had already been through a final goodbye. The last of these orphaned episodes aired on September 24, 1984. It featured Fonzie attempting to join Howard's social fraternity and being subjected to hazing by the other characters. As a piece of television, it was the kind of undignified, low-stakes comedy that the show had always been capable of producing, and that, in its proper context, would have been perfectly acceptable. But as the final image of Happy Days ever broadcast, the last thing that millions of viewers would see these characters do, it was a disaster. The Fonz, one of the most iconic figures in American popular culture, reduced to the butt of a joke in a fraternal hazing sequence, with no resolution, no reflection, no acknowledgement that this was the end of anything. Compare that to what the finale had offered. Fonzie finding a child to love, Joni and Chachi pledging their lives to each other, Howard Cunningham thanking America for being part of his family. The contrast was not subtle. It was brutal. The damage that ABC inflicted on Happy Days in the summer of 1984 had consequences that extended well beyond the show itself. Television is an industry that learns from its mistakes, or at least from mistakes that generate enough public attention to force a reckoning. The Happy Days situation generated exactly that kind of attention. Critics wrote about it extensively.